common myth that you're going to hear about the Scandinavian economies is that they have a higher standard of living and are wealthier than the United States of America.
By pretty much every measure, social democratic countries outperform the United States in providing prosperity to their citizens. So it's pretty hard to argue against making the United States more like them. But of course, that doesn't stop conservatives and libertarians from trying.
Whilst these countries have been performing economically better off in terms of business, etc., that's because these Scandinavian economies are not as socialist as socialists would like to have you believe. In fact, the poorest states in the United States actually have a higher standard of living than that of the Scandinavian economies. Now, as I've explained before on the social market economy, and that's what these Scandinavian economies are, they have the principles of a free market in conjunction with that of the welfare state. These Scandinavian economies have strong economic business freedom, and that's why these economies have been able to fare better off to a certain degree. However, the higher tax rates are harming their economy, and it's in conjunction with that of the welfare state. If you listen to what Polidice has to say here.
A social democracy is a mixed market economy with an activist government that ensures that citizens have universal access to healthcare and affordable education, as well as a living wage and a strong social safety net. So this applies to Europe, especially the Germanic and specifically the Scandinavian countries, as well as to a lesser extent Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, and South Korea.
So he is correct in what he says with regards to the mixed market economy. It uses the fruits of the market-based economy, but of course it strangles it half to death through the high government spending and high tax rates. And one only has to look at recorded history of the Scandinavian economies in order to understand. If you were to look at Sweden, as I've mentioned numerous times before, Sweden before the 1960s, this was their most successful economic time period in their history. Between 1870 to 1960, they became the fourth richest nation per capita GDP in the world. For most of that period, they had a limited small government. They had extremely low levels of government regulation. They never had the higher tax rates. In fact, they had relatively lower tax rates. Most importantly, they never had the big extensive welfare state, and they had high levels of equality proven by the Gini coefficient. Yet despite all of this, they became the fourth richest nation per capita GDP in the world. As a result of introducing the higher tax rates, the strong government regulation, the big extensive welfare state into the 1960s to 1970s, you would begin to see Sweden head in the opposite direction. So much so that by the early 1990s, Sweden plunged into a crisis.
In the 1970s, things began to go wrong, and the Swedish economy began to lag other rich nations. The government gave subsidies to industries in trouble, instead of letting inefficient companies fail and leave room for new and more productive ones. Taxes were sharply increased. At one point, taking into account all taxes, the marginal tax rate was over 100% for some people. All of the new subsidies and benefits resulted in the public sector consuming an even larger share of national output. The 70s was also the decade of new regulations on the labor market, with more protection of workers and more obligations for employers toward employees. The Swedish currency, the krona, was devalued several times in an attempt to boost export industries. This is a bit like peeing in your pants. It's first all warm, but will soon turn cold for a long period ahead. A nasty spiral of even higher wage demands from workers was met with currency devaluations in vain attempts to save businesses. The unpredictability in the economy continued in the 80s, with devaluations combined with expansive fiscal policies, until the country plunged into a crisis in the beginning of the 90s.
Like I said, the time period between 1960 to 1993, for the purpose of this argument, you will see that Sweden dropped from being the fourth richest nation per capita GDP in the world down to the 14th richest by 1993. Judging by their logic, surely the higher tax rates and the big extensive welfare state would have made people collectively richer. How their mindset works, they seem to believe that having the big welfare state is there to help the poor. If Sweden had a high level of equality before 1960, in the absence of the big extensive welfare state and lower tax rates, as soon as the big welfare state was introduced and the higher tax rates and the strong government regulation, how come they dropped from the 4th richest nation per capita GDP in the world down to the 14th richest? What enabled them to get away with the higher tax rates for over such a sustained time period and the strong government regulation was because they were riding off the back of what capitalism created, the wealth that capitalism had created. Because after all, it was capitalism that enabled them to become the 4th richest nation per capita GDP in the world. So as per usual, it's just basically socialists living off the prosperity of what capitalism created and attempting to redistribute. That is to say that when it comes to a welfare states do not create prosperity. How could it? It doesn't create wealth. All it does is take money from another part of the economy and redistributes it. That's called division. It's not called multiplication.
Argument number 1. If socialism is so great, how did it kill 100 million people in the 20th century? So this argument is a confusion of terminology. Pretty much nobody in the United States is calling for a hardline socialism or communism. We're calling for social democracy, which is a completely different economic model from communism and hardline socialism.
I do know that there are a good number out there who do favour communism, but even if we go along with that argument, the mixed economy cannot avoid that of corporatism. The problem with it is the fact that you're still faced with the economic calculation problem. As I've already said, that on the information of profits and losses, you end up with resource misallocation. You have to calculate how much to produce of every single colour.
I really like these too. I'm not really into purple, but recently I realized how little I have in my closet that's purple, and I want to get a lot more.
That is something that these economies are rife with. They waste resources and put it into the wrong parts of the market. This pertains to that of universal healthcare. I mean, a good example of this was, the massive big long waiting lines that you would see in the NHS. Why did that come around? That came around because of a price ceiling, because of trying to make healthcare so-called free.
Sweden does not prove that socialized healthcare works. I would say rather the opposite. The healthcare part of the Swedish public sector is where many of the problems are. The healthcare system is politically planned. They've decided that prices should be zero or close to zero. This of course means that demand is much higher than supply, and this of course leads to huge waiting times.
In other words, basically creating a shortage crisis. And what a shortage basically means, because it's slightly different from scarcity by definition, but the shortage means that people's expectations far exceed and their demands far exceed what is actually available to them. And so what you've been faced with on the British NHS as a prime example is massive big long waiting lines. Because of the inefficiency, people like young girls seeking boob jobs are getting in ahead of people with serious problems such as cancer problems. And there was actually a case in relation to this, and it's why many of the patients left on massive big long waiting lists end up dying of whatever it may be, such as a heart attack, etc., because of such inefficiency. And even the best doctors leave that of the universal healthcare system, such as the NHS, and they go and work in places like the United States. That's why Sweden had actually, brought in the private initiatives that it did, because the universal healthcare system is, abysmal to say the least. We could even talk about that of the social market economies today, because it correlates to this of the social democracies because of the higher tax rates. Even in today's economies, let's take Norway for example, the higher prices are a price signal there to tell you there is a shortage. When you look at these Scandinavian economies and their domestic costs of living, it's through the roof. Why do you think that is? Well, the price signals there are telling you that it's because they have a severe lack of productivity. That's what it's telling you. And why have they got a severe lack of productivity? We'll turn your attention to that of Norway. They have a company called Kongsberg Automotive that only has 5% of their workforce left in Norway? Why is most of their workforce working away in countries like China or the United States conveniently, or of course Mexico? Well, the answer is the company cannot afford to produce in its own home country. How could it? It's been bombed with the higher tax rates. It cannot afford to sustain running business and, having employees in the company in their home country. So what they do is they export the jobs to that of China. As a result of that, what you have is a domestic economy with a severe lack of productivity, and it's been so heavily dependent upon the natural resources for the past 5 to 6 decades. After all, it's been about since the 1960s, 1970s, that Norway's been abusing the North Sea oil. Now that, the oil crisis had came around about 2014, 2015, they began divesting away from oil. The way that socialists look at this is they say, oh, look at their $800 billion oil fund. Well, that's all great and everything, but that's not going to last you forever. You're going to have to find some way in order to get productivity going, in order to get the money coming into the country. You can't sustain living off of that, of an $800 billion oil fund. And the $800 billion oil fund was never meant to be used in the domestic economy. It was supposed to be there for a rainy day in case of a crisis. Well, there you go. A crisis came around, and that crisis is the fact that as a result of the higher tax rates, they're sitting there with a severe lack of productivity in their domestic economy. So how do you rectify that problem? You would deregulate the economy and you would reduce the tax rates. What Polidice would argue for is strong government regulation. I mean, how often have you heard these people talk about and harp off about, oh, deregulation caused the banking crisis? They say that, if it wasn't for government and its regulation, wherever would we be? Well, they're being contradicted. Because what's enabled these countries to sustain themselves over such a long period of time is because they have extremely low levels of government regulation. In fact, Denmark is a country that sits there with low levels of government regulation because by 2001, it began strongly deregulating its economy and rolling back on all the socialist policies.